It's time for the Unnamed SWTOR Podcast, a podcast so good it doesn't need a name. So without any further ado, here's your host, JD. Take it away, Johnny.
Hello my friends, and welcome to episode 59 of the Unnamed SWTOR Podcast, recorded on November 2nd, 2014. How is it November already? Seriously, this year is going so fast. I'm your host, JD, aka Gaddick, and in today's episode, we actually have a dev stream to talk about that wasn't the devs replaying, or not the devs, wasn't Eric Musco or someone else in the community team replaying the Forge Alliance storyline for the umpteenth time. This stream featured Rob Hinkle talking about the changes that will be happening in 3.0, which is a little over a month away. Well, actually, as of today, I think it's a month away, right? Because it's December 2nd. I could look that up, but I'd rather give misinformation. So, yeah, we're a month away from the expansion, which is crazy to think about. I gotta start thinking about taking my time off so I can play some SWTOR for reals. It was an interesting stream, to say the least. There was a lot of information given out there. Some of it we already knew. Some of it I knew from talking with Bruce McLean. So they confirmed some of the information that I had discussed with him, which is great. And some other stuff that we didn't know that was interesting, and some features that are coming that I don't think are so great. So we'll talk about all that. With all that being said, let's force sleep right in.
Red 2, I've got a topic coming in hot requesting clearance to engage.
Lock S-foils and attack positions, you are cleared to discuss.
So I pulled up here the Global Combat Changes live stream notes that Delphi posted to the SWTOR subreddit. Delphi always does a great job, and hopefully she keeps up the great work. I've also taken some notes because I watched it this morning. I wasn't able to actually watch it live, but it's great that Delphi was able to post these notes. I kind of cross-referenced things to make sure everything was there that I wanted to talk about. But I'm going to go through the notes and the way it was discussed, in the order it was discussed, and maybe you can watch and listen along, I guess. I don't know if anybody will actually do that, probably not. But anyway, DPS changes. So the first thing they talked about was the change to how global DPS works. They said that based on their numbers and how they calculate things, players were doing a little bit more damage than they wanted them to. Which is okay, it's fine, I don't really care, I don't get up in arms about stat squishes. It's odd because when I was speaking with Bruce McLean, he did say that he didn't think there was any stat squish in the horizon. This sounds like a stat squish. It's not a, you'll get less of the stat, you'll just get less of whatever you're getting per stat. Which is, I assume, how they're going to do it, or else they're just going to change the actual abilities themselves and how the factors in there work, and change how damage is actually calculated on each ability, but more than likely it'll be just a reduction in the amount you gain for each stat, which is fine. Again, like I said, I'm not gonna get up in arms over stat squishes, just found that a little odd. I think it's fine to reduce the amount of damage people do. I don't think everyone has to be doing 3 million damage like you do in WoW now or whatever. I don't think that's, I mean, it's cool to see big numbers, obviously gamers want to see big numbers. But I don't think there's a big, and in fact there have been many studies that have shown just once you get to a certain threshold, it doesn't really matter what the number is, you can't really fathom it anyway, so the difference between 3 million and 300 million to you is like not big, it's just a bunch of really big numbers. To me, same to me, like I don't care if I'm doing 3,000 or 5,000 damage, it's just like how am I doing versus other people, and as long as that's in tow, then I'm fine with it. They also talked about how this might affect current content. Obviously, the DFDP Nightmare could be affected with this, and this is kind of a theme throughout all of these changes. They could affect current content, which is understandable. They'll tweak things that they have to. Also, they talked about the changes to buffs and debuffs and how cleansing will work, and that we'll talk about a little later, but that could obviously cause problems in the current Nightmare. What I don't like so much is the fact that Nightmare DFDP will be a means of getting gear of some sort in the future. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but they said it won't be a mandatory part of progression. It'll just be an optional, side quest. Maybe it'll give ultimate comms. Maybe it'll give mirror sets of gear. So if you want to get your gloves, for example, you can go get the second boss of the current content, or you can get the fourth boss or whatever of Nightmare DFDP. And as someone who did Nightmare DF and a little bit of DP, I could honestly be fine never seeing those flashpoints again, operations again. Maybe not never. I don't think don't think it's ever good to say you never like to see things, because there's a definite nostalgia factor for a lot of raiders. You know, I can go into EV right now because I haven't been in there in a long time, and I probably find it really cool and really enjoyable. You know, you kind of relearn, you pick up the things that you remember having to do. You get some nostalgia factor in there. I think that's an important thing that they're not leveraging, and they could definitely leverage better in the future if, say, they brought back Nightmare DFDP as an optional side tier, you know, 2 patches from now. I think it would be a lot more interesting than them just saying, well, you've done Nightmare DFDP for over a year now, because we're past the Halloween season, and I believe it was released around Halloween last year. So you've been doing Dread Fortress and Dread Palace for over a year now. Well, hey, you guys want to do it again, right? It's just optional, but who on earth is okay and wants to do that? That's the thing. Yes, it's optional, but who wants to do it unless you have to? And that becomes a big problem. If you sort of force players to do it by making it so you can only max out your ultimate comms, or making it so it's the easier way to get a certain piece of gear, or if, you know, the current hard mode races are defined by whoever could complete the Nightmare DF first and then go into the hard mode versus just going into the hard mode, I think that you can only cause problems by doing something like that. So I think that they'd be much better served doing something like upgrading EC Nightmare. If they upgraded EC Nightmare to the current Nightmare, I'd happily go back in there and do that again, because that was a lot of fun. And I have great memories of that, and I'm not burned out on it. If you had said, when they were releasing 2.0, hey, EC is Nightmare in 55, that's level 55 content, it's only optional, I would have never done it. So I think that they really need to take that into account, and instead of doing the easy thing that they can do now to add quote-unquote content to the game, which I'm sure was their reasoning behind this, hey, we could use more content for the endgame PvEers, let's just add in Nightmare DFDP to the whatever, the progression, however they want to consider it, or whatever they want to call it. That's easy. We can just throw it in there. Just do it. It's extra content. Yeah, do it. Instead of doing that, really take the time, really improve, bring things up to the current level. They didn't really explicitly say it, but it sounds like it will just be 55 Nightmare, Dread Fortress, and Dread Palace, which if you've done EC and Nightmare, you know it's still at 55. You have to do the mechanics or it will kill you. So I'm not saying that this is going to be a cakewalk by any means, but I'm just saying who in the right mind is going to want to do that again? I just don't know who that's for. Bring back EC. That's what I'm saying they should have done. And obviously it's probably too late for that now, but if they had brought EC up to the level of 60 and made that the optional tier of raid, I guarantee you a lot more players would have been willing to do that, and a lot more players would have been happy to do that. Instead of something like, who cares? You get something, hey, yeah, I remember EC. Let's go ahead and do that a couple times. So I feel like the Nightmare DFDP thing was like a throw-in that isn't going to be of any substance, isn't going to do anyone any favors, really. I don't see why they would do something like that. Moving right along, they talked about raid buffs. Every advanced class now gets some form of raid buff, and this could be a debuff that you put on the opponent, something like increased range damage, sort of like the armor debuff that you get for snipers and gunslingers. Now they'll have, you know, ranged attack, tech attack, force attack, increased modifiers like that. You get all sorts of armor cracks, all sorts of things like that, or you get some kind of raid-wide buff. You get something like inspiration that affects everyone in your raid, and it causes a giant lockout, and you can only do it once every 5 minutes, not done in arenas, things like that. Which I think is a very good idea. I've been saying for a long time how much I thought they needed to add in something like this, where every class gets their own specific raid buff, because I think that in and of itself helps increase the viability of all different classes. If you have a class that is the most DPS class, the highest DPS class, which is going to happen, there's no amount of balancing you can do in an MMO like SWTOR or WoW or Rift or any other game that's going to bring everything into, you know, a flat line. Everyone does the exact same amount of damage, has the exact same skill cap and things like that. It's impossible. It's not going to happen. So one of the ways you can kind of fudge the numbers and make it more of a range that you need to fall into is by giving them important buffs that help everyone in your group. If, say, the Marauder did 5% less damage than they do now, but they still brought in inspiration, or I forget what the imp side is of it, but whatever. They still bring in inspiration, they still bring in predation, all of those awesome raid-wide buffs that they get, they would still probably be a hot commodity in the raiding community, especially in the harder content as the DPS requirements get stricter and stricter. If you're not getting up to the par level that you need to do in order to get into those hard modes, then you're not going to be taken unless you can do something else that helps boost the numbers of everyone. If you're down 5%, but if you can bring up in an 8-man the other 3 DPSs, that's a very confusing sentence. If you can bring up the DPS of all of your raid members by 2.5%, that's a 7.5% increase in your group's DPS, which is great. Well, it's not 7.5%, is it? Because you can do the math and tell me how much it is, but it's going to be more than that 5% that you're taking away from your own DPS. So if they add more debuffs in like that, I think that they'll end up, especially in PvE, not so much in PvP, but maybe somewhat, they'll definitely end up creating a environment where more classes can be taken and more classes are viable in endgame content. Now, I really like the fact that they said, and Rob Hinkle on the stream said this, and it seems to be their philosophy, is that they're focused on having raid groups want members of all advanced classes. They want you taking in an 8-man one of each advanced class as in your raid group, and I think that's fine. And in a 16-man, you're still going to want at least 8 different advanced classes, and then maybe you can stack from there, which I think is a great idea. And it really goes contrary to the stance that WoW took, and this was the fact that you're supposed to bring the player, not the class. And I always hated that. It sounds so good in theory, you know, well, you want to bring a whole bunch of great players, and that's how you get a good raid group together. And while that sounds great, you end up in a situation where all classes are kind of homogenized and everyone gets the exact same boost. Now you have 3 different classes that can do a bloodthirst in WoW, and 3 different classes that do an armor debuff, and 3 different classes that do this. And that creates a problem in and of itself because, well, if you're one of the 3 people that can bring the heroism buff in your WoW raid, well, which of those classes does the most DPS? Oh, I want that class. Oh, I don't want the other 2 classes. And the other 2 classes get left out. And you end up in a situation where you exclude players with the philosophy of bring the player, not the class, because it turns into bringing the class that I want and the player that plays that class instead of bringing the player. I think it's important to have the philosophy. And back in the day, I was a big fan of Total Biscuit's Blue Please podcast, and he was always of the mindset and always had the philosophy of you're supposed to bring the player and the class, and that I loved. I thought that clicked perfectly. Yes, you're supposed to bring the class that you're playing and the best player of that class. It shouldn't be, I'm going to pick the best class out of these 3 and whatever, you know, the average player of that class is going to be fine. They're bringing everything I want. You want players to pick, you want a variety of classes being taken. You want each class to feel like I have a role, I have a niche, not, well, I'm in this kind of nebulous area where I bring this, but someone else does this better than me, and I bring this, but, well, I don't do this so well. You want players to be thinking, okay, I want this class, let's find a player that I like of this class. I want this class, okay, let's find a player I want of this class. And with that philosophy, you've really opened it up to pretty much whoever you want to take in your raid, you can take. Now, the problem with this is obviously balance. You can't have certain classes having the mandatory ones, or the ones that stack better, or the ones that work better in all situations. You want to make sure that each one is balanced where there is a niche role for each person. Maybe you can have, well, I want to bring 2 commandos and 2 marauders, say, for this raid because their buffs stack in a certain way, and that's what I want. That's fine, but I think it's important not to have it, well, I'm doing 20% more damage than a normal group that's split up between all the advanced classes by stacking this class and this class, so I'm just going to stack this class and this class. Even if it's not the best, and this is how balance goes, even if it isn't necessarily required to do X, Y, and Z, if there's something that is provably and obviously the best in all situations, players are going to latch onto that, and they're going to start policing their own raids, they're going to start kicking out players of the suboptimal classes, things like that. You want to make sure that the players feel like each class has a role, plays a part, does something great for the group, and that's how you foster a community that will be willing to take all classes of all different types, and would make these raid buffs work perfectly. I'll have to see how it goes in actual practice. There's one about you get some kind of alacrity buff, raid-wide. There's another one, raid-wide crit buff. So all of these could be great, They could also suck, they say they're boosting up alacrity. Who's to say that they don't just nerf it right back down like they did in 2.0 when they changed alacrity and, maybe the crit diminishing returns make the crit buff not work properly. But if they can make it so that each class fills a niche, fills a role, feels like they're needed, and makes the raid leader, which is really the person that they should be trying to, preach here and get into the minds of, then I think that the whole raid buff changes will be a great addition to the game and something that I think they've needed for a long time and will do wonders. Alright, so I've only done 2 topics so far, and I'm ready for a break, but when we come back, we'll talk about accuracy, we'll talk about sorting, we'll talk about bolster, expertise, all of that fun stuff, right after the break. Let's continue right down the list, shall we? They discussed training dummies, which wasn't very interesting. They just said that the operations dummies that they have, the modules that you can use to put the debuff, the armor debuff on those training dummies will now provide all of the debuffs, all the different raid debuffs that we just discussed. They'll be able to be put on the training dummies, so you can do your rotations and all that good stuff, your parses, and upload the best parses. You can now do all that with the training dummies. And they talked about dots, and this has been a very controversial change for some reason, that a lot of players I find don't really like this change that they've made. Dots, if you are unaware, can no longer be cleansed off of players. So if you are a dot class, if you're playing against a dot class, you can no longer cleanse those dots off of yourself, off of other players. You can still purge them, so your dodge off of your operatives and your force shroud off of your assassins, those can still be used. But the regular old cleanses can no longer be used to remove dots from players. And I think a lot of players have taken offense to this. They don't like the fact that you can't remove these dots. But I personally feel like it's an important change. It's not a good idea to invalidate certain classes just by a single button. Right now I think it's too easy for a player to see debuffs on a debuff bar and just cleanse them. And they kind of dealt with this in a half measure of making some of the dots cleansable, giving some of the classes the oops try again dot, where if you cleanse it, it just puts another smaller version of the dot on. And I think that just defeats the purpose, sort of, where, okay, well, if I cleanse this one, I can't cleanse this one half cleanses, and that's just a silly game to be playing. I like the going whole hog and saying dots cannot be cleansed. I think that this actually might make it a little harder to be a healer in PvP, which is a good change. You can't just negate thousands of damage with a single button. You have to heal, use multiple heals maybe to overcome those dots, which is a good thing in my opinion. It also makes it so that those non-dot classes that rely on single dots, say the Sork, the Lightning Sork, that relies on having a single dot on the player so that they can use Thundering Blast and get the auto crit, they don't get negated as easily. You don't incidentally lose your key ability even in a non-dot class just because you can't have a dot on a player. So I think that's a great change. I also like the fact that now you can cleanse CCs, which I think a lot of players also don't like. The fact that if you're stunned, if you're whirlwinded, or if you're mezzed, however you get CC'd, you can be cleansed out of it, which I think is a great change to PvP, and I think will make players think on their feet a little bit more, make players really value that cleanse, make the healers think about things other than just raw numbers and getting the bars up. You have to be cognizant of when the ideal time to use a CC break is going to be. It forces players to coordinate a little better. You know, if you're going to break a CC, or if I'm going to cleanse it off you, let me cleanse it and you can break the next one, or you know, you break this one, I'll cleanse this other one that's going on. It also adds another layer to DPSers in PvP because they can become the MVP just by cleansing off a stun or a whirlwind, or the second stun that on a healer that's already used their breaker. I think that'll become incredibly important in PvP, which is a great change in my opinion. Anything to make it less meta, less flavor of the month, less focused on a single thing. Get players thinking on more levels. Make it not just about damaging down X player. Making players in PvP think on multiple levels is what makes PvP interesting. It changes from match to match, game to game, player to player, what you should be focusing on. And if there are a lot of different levels, it can even change within a single war zone or a single arena what you should be focusing on and what needs to be focused on. It makes players think on their feet a little bit more, and that's what makes PvP in an MMO stand out, is that thinking on multiple levels, acting and coming up with tactics on the fly, communicating. And I think this only adds to that. It doesn't take away from it like some players think. I think this will make it more interesting to PvP. And hopefully this will go to shake up the meta of certain classes and certain healers being dominant and certain compositions being overwhelmingly powerful. I think that this is a change that could do that, and we'll have to see how it actually works in practice before I say without a doubt that it will do that. But it's a big change in a system that I think needed a big change, and it's about time we got something like that for PvP. And maybe this will actually shake things up enough where PvPers feel like there's something fresh and new for them to do, because God knows they haven't gotten a war zone in how long. But I digress. They also talked about certain stats like accuracy, which I think is a huge quality of life improvement to give tanks 100% accuracy when they're in tank stance. That's super convenient. It allows tank threat to be so much more predictable. There's no chance of a missed ability in there and you lose a whole bunch of threat on your DPS because you missed an ability somewhere in your rotation. I think giving tanks 100% accuracy, great improvement. I actually think it should be done in all MMOs. Tanks should not be missing. They should be getting all their abilities in there. They're not in there to get accuracy. They're in there to hold threat. And putting in random chances in there and not making that a core mechanic, I think there's a big problem with adding small, variances, small chances for bad things to happen, small, not focal points that could go wrong in your game. I think if you're going to have chance play a part in it, make it a big part. Make it a 50% accuracy. Tanks only have 50% accuracy, deal with it. Or tanks have 100% accuracy. I think if you go, well, there's a little bit of a chance, it ruins a lot by just putting that small thing in there. Make it either a focus, a feature, something big, or make it non-existent, because the one or two attempts, oh, we had a great attempt going and then the tank missed and lost aggro and this, just wipe it, whatever, it's a one in a whatever shot. Like that's silly, that's stupid. I don't think there's a place for that unless that's the focus of the game. So giving tanks 100% accuracy is a great change in my opinion. I also like that they've removed the free sources of accuracy from the disciplines tree, so you don't get the skills like 3% accuracy on these certain skills, so you need less accuracy than other stats. I think it's important to have a baseline and make all players in all classes, DPS classes that is, get the same level of accuracy, allow the devs to balance the other stats, accounting for that stat loss in accuracy. How you get it is up to you. You can get it on however gear, augments, whatever you want to do. But I think it's important to have all classes, and especially all specs, because it's really annoying if I want to change from sharpshooter, say, to the hybrid. Well, there will be no hybrids, but if I want to change from sharpshooter to another spec that may not have the increased accuracy in it, I have to get a whole new set of gear to get that 100% accuracy if I want to switch specs, and sometimes I do want to switch specs, so it's annoying to make me have to do that. Some of that could be alleviated with the new stat tracking or stat whatever system that they're going to put in, where gear is independent of stats. At least that's what Bruce McLean said was going to happen, but we'll see. We haven't heard any word from official sources that will definitely be happening. But let's just assume it will. That could be alleviated somewhat there. But I think it's silly to have players have to change specs and then change gear to be within the same DPS spec. I mean, maybe there are some other situations where that will still be necessary. Maybe this spec needs alacrity, this spec needs crit, or however it ends up happening. But I think that make it a baseline. But I think by making it a baseline, requiring all classes, all ACs to get the same amount of accuracy is a good thing for the game and a nice change. Nice quality of life change too for new players. How much accuracy do I need in this class? This class, it's more uniform. It's easier to explain to those players, hey, you need this amount of accuracy, so go ahead and gear for this amount. No matter what class you're on, this is what you're going to want. I think that's a big improvement for new players as well. They also highlighted a couple of important items for PvPers. There seems to be a lot of PvE, I'm doing it again. There seems to be a lot of player versus environment discussion here, but the dot thing was a player versus player highlight, obviously. But they discussed bolster. They said that they will be taking augments into account when they do the bolster system. This makes sense, seeing as it's very odd that they allowed for augments to not be on the bolster system. They allowed augments to basically be a free boost over a non-augmented person in a system that's trying to alleviate newer players who may not understand how augments work, how they want to be augmenting. It doesn't really make sense to me why they allowed that for so long. Dolphy highlights a great comment that they made that they're aiming for a 20 to 25% gear difference between the new player and the most geared PvPers, and augments are responsible currently for 16% of your power. It is kind of ridiculous to allow a player to get a 16% bonus advantage on top of the 25% gear differential, debatably, that you're looking for. So that's insane, that's crazy. I'm glad that they're changing that. And on top of that, they discussed expertise, which I know is every PvPer's favorite stat. They said that expertise is not moving. The current level, the current max tier of expertise will be staying where it is in the level 60 gear, but the stats will increase. So your current PvP gear will still be fine, but the level 60 PvP gear will have higher of the other stats, which I think is a good thing. I think that expertise should be the gate to get you in the door for PvP. So if you want to do PvP, you should be able to do the top level raid stuff and have the best stats in the game so that you can beat out the PvP stats. And to combat that, if you don't have expertise, oh well, the PvPers, they have to have the highest stats in the game, so you have to do PvP in order to get the highest level PvE content done, and that you get that back and forth. So there needs to be some kind of gate between PvE content and PvP content, and I think expertise provides that perfectly, giving you a percentage boost to other players, damage done to other players, and making that your entry level into PvP, your requirement to PvP, is a great idea in my opinion. I don't understand why PvPers are so down on expertise. It's just the gate that prevents the top level PvEers from coming in and having the best gear in PvP and vice versa. I don't see a problem with that. I think it's important that they're not increasing the amount of expertise that you get, or the amount that expertise does for your character, because it's obviously a percentage based thing, and that could run away and go spiraling out of control too quickly if they said, okay, now you get a 30% increased damage to other players and you just have to get more expertise. You can have more expertise. I think that's silly. I think that expertise, and I've discussed in previous podcasts how I would be behind removing expertise if they marked gear as PvE or PvP. So instead of having to get a stat called expertise, you just have PvP gear, which gives you the innate, I think it's 15 or 20% increased damage to other players and increased healing and reduced damage from other players, etc., etc. I would support a system like that, but I'm fine with expertise as it is. It can stay as is, and I don't have a problem with it. And I don't think you should have a problem with it either. Get over it. It's expertise. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Caveat, unless you're talking about how the bolster system is broken and expertise doesn't really make sense with how they calculate the bolster system, I will listen to discussions about how the bolster system needs to be improved. I will not listen to discussions where bolster should be removed from the game, it's stupid, and expertise also removed from the game. Those are conversations I'm not going to have with you. And then finally, a small cosmetic change that they highlighted, but it's such a godsend that it's coming, is the debuff sorting. They're highlighting your procs when they happen. You can highlight your own personal debuffs on a target. So if you have 6 snipers in a group, you can see which dots are yours. You can see which debuffs are yours. It doesn't seem like there's a way to sort out which debuffs you want to highlight, which ones you don't want to highlight, things like that. But you can highlight by time. You can sort it in your debuff bar. They said they're working on getting cleansable highlights, so if you have a cleansable debuff, or if you have some kind of debuff that is cleansable in PvE, it will be highlighted on your bars so healers can see it. I think that should be made a priority. That seems like a very simple thing, but a very important thing that would be a huge quality of life feature for a lot of raiders. I mean, we got click casting too while we're at it. Probably not, but I'll keep asking for click casting, because once I get click casting, then I'll start playing a healer again. Not playing a healer until they get click casting in the game. I need it. I'm that bad. They also identified the problem of buff bar bloat, where you could have a billion zillion debuffs on your bars now because everyone has a debuff, everyone has a raid utility ability. Everyone can cast a raid utility spell and help everyone. So your debuff bars could be huge with all your exhaustions and your dots and your hots and your whatever else you got on your buff bars, your pets, your kick the hot ball, whatever. They've identified the fact that that's possibly a problem. They said they're working on it. They have their UI guys looking into solutions. I think they could easily just steal the thing from WoW where they consolidate all the class buffs and all the long-term buffs that you get into a single buff thing, and you can mouse over it and see all the different buffs that are consolidated underneath that one buff. Now, there are situations where maybe you don't realize, I don't have the night buff right now because they're all in there and you don't see it. But I think those corner cases are small compared to the quality of life that you'll gain by reducing the amount of things you see on the buff bar at one time. And those are the big highlights for me from the dev stream. There were a lot of other questions asked, a lot of other questions answered, and a lot of other questions not touched. But if you want to see what they discussed, you can go look at the VOD. It's up on Twitch right now. You can also check out Dolphy's description. It's pretty good. It gets most of the major points, but maybe some of the smaller things you want to watch the video to actually see exactly what was said and how it was said. So I encourage you to do both. Check it out for yourselves. Let me know what you think. Tell me I'm totally wrong. Tell me how much you agree with me. You know, Gaddockteague at gaddockgaming.com or at gteague on Twitter. Go ahead. Tell me where you stand on the stream. And with that, it's time for the Wall of Crazy.
What? That's impossible, even for a computer.
It's not impossible. I used to bullseye Womper rats in my T16 back home. They're not much bigger than 2 meters.
And this week's Wall of Crazy topic isn't so much a topic SWTOR, but something I find crazy, and that's the fact that people actually contributed and watched and cheered me on in last week's extra live stream. There's so much love in the air. I mean, not that kind of love, but you know, just such a camaraderie around Extra Life. It's such a fun event. A lot of different people did it this year. Last year, I feel like I was one of the few SWTOR people actually doing it. This year, a ton of people, Bad Feeling Podcast guys, Red, a bunch of other guys. I'm sorry if I didn't mention you. A lot of money was raised in the SWTOR community. I think it was an awesome event. So it's crazy that happened, and thank you all so much for contributing, opening up your wallet, and donating. It's a real profound feeling to feel like you're contributing in such a great event. So thank you so much. That's all I have to say. That's all I wanted to cover in this week's Wall of Crazy. Next week, maybe I'll get back to doing real Wall of Crazies where I ask you topics on Twitter. But this one goes out to you guys, so thank you all so much. And that will about do it for this week's show. As always, if you'd like to contact me, you can send your questions, comments, concerns to Gaddockteague at gaddockgaming.com, or you can tweet them to @gteague on Twitter. That's GTEEG on Twitter. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes to get your weekly podcast updates, and if you do subscribe on iTunes, go ahead and leave me a nice review or comment on there. That would be much appreciated. If you're new to the game or thinking of resubscribing, I provided my Refer a Friend link in the show notes, so if you'd like a little added incentive to come back, feel free to use it. You can also check out my website, gaddockgaming.com, where I host the podcast, blogs, and any other gaming musings that I would like to get up there. I'm really hoping to kick gaddockgaming.com into high gear as we get into the holidays, and especially as we go into the new year. I'll have updates to follow. I have ideas in my head, so I'm really want to get the website going, so check that out. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Unnamed SWTOR Podcast. This is JD, signing off.